If you wanted an elegant and well-poured cocktail at the turn of the 20th century, there was no place like the great saloons of New York City.
You could have bartenders who became kind of superstars, like the famous Jerry Thomas. He devised a drink where you set it on fire that would create a kind of a roaring effect as the oxygen kind of fed into the flames. It was a real dazzler.
But the fancy saloons had to close when Prohibition made them illegal. Thousands of private clubs sprang up to take their place. They were hidden. They were hush-hush. They were speakeasies. I'm in one of the secrets of New York right now. I'm in the last bar still standing that was once run by the most famous speakeasy hostess of all time.
She was a bleached blonde, very buxom lady who would appear in a salmon-colored dress, stand on a chair, and say, "Hello, suckers," and welcome everyone in.
The social rule book was out the window. Now, you could dance with someone you'd never met before, to music you'd never heard before, go to places you've never been before. There's a secret street in Harlem where integration in the city really began, and it still all revolves around one thing.
It looks the exact same way. It's tiny, it's small, you have intimate relationships. It's all the things it's supposed to be. And most of all, it is the one thing that survived Prohibition that did it in a good way, and that's jazz.
People of color and white musicians from downtown would come up and become inspired by the blues and jazz that they heard there. It would change their lives.
The 1920s changed everybody's lives, and speakeasies were the place where it all bubbled to the top. They hosted the city's longest-running party, but you had to know somebody to get in. Come with me, and we'll book a private table at one of the hottest secrets of New York.
Before Prohibition, the saloons of New York ranged from absolutely the worst sort of dive, where you could get drink for a couple of pennies, to wonderful temples of the cocktail art practiced by great masters. And behind the bar would be an array of ingredients, almost like in the kitchen of a good restaurant.
The best saloons boasted hundreds of infused cordials, spices, and brandies, with bartenders who used them to invent new cocktails every day. An army of newspaper writers reported every move, like today's cooking shows.
It was an era in which bartenders would create cocktails and name them for events of the day. One of the things that added to the fame of the bartenders and the renown of the cocktail was the fact that you had a lot of journalists patronizing these places and writing about them, and in some cases devoting entire columns to the subject of cocktails and presenting recipes all the time.
Newspaper writers spent a lot of time covering this culture because they lived in the saloons and it was an easy place to get a story. Some of the bartenders in the 19th century, celebrity bartenders, had great followings like chefs do today, celebrity chefs.
Jerry Thomas was the most famous bartender of the 19th century. He traveled all over the United States, even went on tour with gold-plated cocktail instruments over to England. He returned to New York, his native city, and opened a saloon on 23rd and Broadway. General Grant would stop in, Charles Dickens would stop in at his bar, the Prince of Wales was taken to see him when he was in New York. He was an attraction in New York.
So our first secret of New York is a cocktail from the 1880s you can't find today. What better place to try it than Bill's Gay 90s on East 54th Street, where you can still feel like you're part of the city's great saloon culture. Today we have celebrity chefs. Back then we had celebrity bartenders.
New York had a long tradition of celebrity bartenders, guys who were famous for not only for mixing drinks, but for how they ran their places and the kinds of characters they were. There were a raft of guys, but the most famous of them all was Jerry Thomas.
Why was Jerry Thomas so famous?
Well, he was famous for a whole number of things. He was a very sporty character. He was a 33rd degree Mason. He belonged to all the fraternal societies. He was an artist. He painted, he drew, and in 1862 he wrote the world's first bartender's guide and brought together all these American drinks that he'd discovered in his travels. Well, there was one drink that made him famous, this spectacular little thing called the Blue Blazer, which involves pouring a flaming arc of whiskey back and forth between a couple of silver mugs and then putting it in glasses and serving it to the customer.
Dave, can you make me a Blue Blazer?
Kelly, I can make you a Blue Blazer, but at some point, we're going to have to dim the lights.
Back in the 1860s, they hadn't invented cocktail shakers with lids, so you used 2 silver mugs and a bottle of killer scotch.
And finally, we're going to light it on fire and get some oxygen in there.
That's beautiful.
And this is the Blue Blazer. Back and forth, you aerate it, you get the fires flamed. And you got to imagine, these were done in dark bars with gas light, you know? And that would be this very dramatic light. I'm just going to pour it out. It's still on fire, so we'll be careful there. And then we cap it, and we have a couple of Blue Blazers.
It seemed like great drinks in classy saloons would go on forever in cities like New York and Chicago. But in smaller towns, pressure was building from part of America that hadn't spoken up before.
Women were getting a voice in terms of what they wanted and didn't want. 1873, back out in Ohio, women sat down in saloons and said, no more. No more drunk husbands. We're going to sit right here. And Carrie Nation said, I'll get the axe and we'll start bashing in the saloons. And out of that came a movement that led to the passing of that amendment, which allowed Prohibition to become an actual law.
The temperance movement pushed Congress to force the 13th Amendment past a presidential veto to make the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol illegal anywhere in the United States. It was called the Volstead Act, and it went into effect in 1920 over the objections of a young congressman from New York City named Fiorello LaGuardia, who predicted it would be impossible to enforce and would probably breed contempt for the law.
People weren't going to stop drinking. That was very clear from the very first days of Prohibition. As soon as people knew the law was going into effect, they bought up every bottle of liquor available in New York City, which told you right away people weren't really planning to give it up.
It's the revenge of a white Protestant culture against the big cities. It's the idea all the evil is in the big cities, so we're going to end this evil by making alcohol illegal. It's the preacher mentality. And what we have is the United States versus New York City.
Of course, big cities had the world-class restaurants and bars, and the new law hit them the hardest.
Prohibition really put the nail in the coffin for the great saloons and the great restaurants that had led up to the First World War and after. And of course, the profession of bartender became obsolete.
You couldn't mix fancy cocktails in a place that just served shots of bootleg whiskey. But to a lot of New Yorkers, bootleg booze was better than nothing. A new business model sprang up overnight. Speakeasies started springing up everywhere in the city, in private clubs, rented apartments, auto garages, even the back rooms of funeral parlors. High class or low class, you were breaking the law if you drank at one. It was a whole new way to have fun.
The phrase from the 1920s is anything goes. So you could be raunchier, you could have different types of music, people could dance in ways that they wouldn't have danced before. All the regulation is gone, so you really could get away with pretty much anything.
One of the ironies of Prohibition is that it was supposed to shut down not only drinking, but the drinking establishments, the saloons and the taverns. And, you know, it actually had the exact opposite effect. And then within a couple years after Prohibition was passed, there were 32,000 speakeasies in New York. And by 1932, the year before Prohibition ended, some figures go as high as 100,000. So more people were drinking more often. They were drinking more intoxicating liquor.
In fact, now that bars were illegal, nobody was regulating when people could get a drink or exactly what they were drinking.
You'd rent this little apartment, you'd throw in a quick bar made out of plywood, you'd get a case of bootleg whiskey right off of the boat, you'd water it down and add grain alcohol that you bought in Brooklyn from some guy who was distilling it from turnip tops in his basement. And you would cut it, you'd put some food coloring in there, maybe a little cayenne pepper to give it some kick again, and you would set up to selling it at $1 a shot.
Vivid stories of very dangerous wood alcohol and so on being sold to people. New York City had one of the densest concentrations of liquor manufactured in apartments, on rooftops, in abandoned factories.
There was one way to get legal whiskey. You could ask your doctor to write a prescription for medicinal alcohol and pick it up at your local drugstore. It was expensive, and it came in a small pint bottle, but at least it wouldn't kill you. Suddenly, the drugstore business became very popular.
The pharmacy industry became a front for bootlegging. So the number of licensed pharmacies in New York tripled during Prohibition. It was just a very convenient way to dispense liquor.
But not as convenient as walking into the back room of the building next door and joining the crowd at the bar. The music was hotter, the rooms were smaller, and you know what? Bars weren't just for men anymore.
Suddenly, you have women without shame just walking into speakeasies, putting a foot on the brass rail, which was just about the most masculine thing that you could do in American society. And suddenly they were elbow to elbow with men they'd never seen before, and it was a whole new social mixture that just had not existed before Prohibition.
Joe sent me.
The front room of the speakeasy was like a salon where you had tea. You had to knock on a door, someone, you know, with an eye hole looked through that door, or you slipped a piece of paper and you were let in. It was the feeling of being in an exclusive world. People gathered together, the high and the low, the rich and the poor, the famous and the unfamous, and they celebrated what they felt was a coming of age of New York City.
Midtown Manhattan started celebrating even harder than other places. It boasted a string of undercover establishments that became more than speakeasies. They were the first real nightclubs, and they attracted some very high rollers. If you were in a fancy speakeasy in the 1920s, you never knew who might be in the same room. Gangsters, con men, millionaires. I'm in one of the secrets of New York right now. I'm in the last bar still standing that was once run by the most famous speakeasy hostess of all time, Texas Guinan. Today it's called Flute, where a group named Club Wits End celebrates the 20s by drinking out of teacups. If the police showed up during Prohibition, you could always pretend it wasn't really liquor. Back in the day, it was one of a dozen clubs hosted by the fabulous Texas Guinan, a brassy lady who became the face of the jazz age.
That irrepressible queen of New York nightlife, Texas Guinan.
If you're going to pick one figure to be your torchbearer, the Statue of Liberty figure for the Prohibition era, then Texas Guinan is the one. She was a loud, brassy saloon owner who ran some of the most popular joints in town.
She comes from Waco, Texas. She's a dancer. She's also the first cowgirl in silent films. But of course, silent films, that's not much of a career. And suddenly, with Prohibition, she's reborn as a hostess, a nightclub hostess.
She was a vaudeville veteran, knew all of the routines and tricks of keeping audiences interested, of dealing with hecklers and audiences and heckling them back. As a hostess, she would insult the audience members, saying, "Hello, suckers."
They were suckers, and they knew it. Anybody who managed to get into one of Texas's clubs was paying top prices for watered-down booze, and they loved it when she made fun of them.
Now you all feel good now, but wait till your chest out.
That was the price you paid to mix with the rich and famous.
Only the highest rollers, the biggest spenders, were allowed in. And they paid a lot of money, as much as $20 for a bottle of liquor, a $10 cover charge simply to walk through the door per person. And so a party could expect to spend hundreds of dollars in the mid-1920s at one of the leading nightclubs in Manhattan. Well, that was a great deal of money in the 1920s. The average annual income in the United States was about $600 a year.
It wasn't just about spending money. It was about breaking the law.
People like Texas Guinan were heroes and heroines because they stood up to a law that a lot of people thought was ridiculous.
Soon, New Yorkers were following every sassy move Texas made. Her nightclubs were the place to be, even though everyone knew they were serving illegal booze.
You could see Jimmy Walker, the mayor. You could see the chief of police. You might even see J. Edgar Hoover, even though he would pretend that he wasn't there. But everybody wanted to go to Texas's clubs. So you had all the millionaires, you had all the showgirls. Everybody who was anybody wanted to be seen, and there was no other place to be seen but one of Texas's clubs.
Well, Jimmy Walker was mayor by day, and Texas Guinan was mayor by night. And it was this recognition that the nightlife had become such an important part of New York City life that nightclub hostess was really regarded as a leading figure in the city.
He is Broadway's greatest sucker. Give him a big hand.
The thing that really made Texas Guinan famous was that she thumbed her nose at the law. Her wealthy customers looked forward to being raided by the authorities. It was all part of the show, and Texas would play right along.
If the police came marching in and smashing up the place, she would strike up the band and sing the prisoner's song, and the showgirls would put on a show. A raid was nothing to panic about if it was seen as part of the evening's entertainment.
When she got busted, it was just another part of the act. You knew she would be back in business in a week, and that's what she did. The idea that this woman was essentially saying, boys, come and get me. And they'd come and get her and take her away, and it didn't dim her enthusiasm in the slightest.
Police raids also meant that everything in speakeasies had to be portable. There was no more stage to separate performers who worked right on the dance floor next to the customers. It began to change American entertainment.
There were performers in the speakeasies, but the performers were 2 feet away from the audience. The performers were part of the audience. There was a tremendous interchange, so it created a different kind of culture, a kind of intimacy. The entertainers had to change their routines.
Stand-up comics were more in your face. Singers could look you right in the eye. Surrounding all of it was jazz, the music that allowed Prohibition to break through another social barrier, a racial barrier.
Jazz is the only music that we have created in this country that we can claim as ours. You know, that's the only music form that we can claim as an indigenous American art form, world contribution. It's jazz. And the black experience brought to that something that the white ear had never heard. And when white people heard that, it was like they set them on fire. They could not understand it. They couldn't believe it.
The 20s coincides with the rise of jazz as one of the great American art forms. And who were the dominant influences, practitioners, geniuses of this art form but black Americans? And where was the capital of black America? It was in Harlem. So it's no wonder that white New Yorkers were taking the A train, going up to the Cotton Club and other clubs to see entertainment that was the most exciting thing going on. It was one of the great cultural revolutions of the 20th century.
The big clubs, such as Connie's or such as the Cotton Club, they had to attract a white audience because the blacks couldn't go in. Blacks would only go in the service door to entertain. That was the way it was. And there was never a mixing of races in the club area where the tables were. They still did not integrate except for entertainment.
There was a high degree of manipulation or ownership by whites. Nevertheless, the exposure of black cultural forms to a white audience is an earth-shaking event. Think how different the music they were hearing in Harlem was. The whole tone of it, the whole step of it, the dances. The money behind it may have been white, but the performers, the talent, the inspiration, that was all black. And, you know, America would never be the same again.
While the Savoy Ballroom, Connie's, and the Cotton Club drew the crowds, there was a place in Harlem where musicians, white and black, could sit together after the big clubs closed. You can walk down one of the secrets of New York if you come uptown to West 133rd Street. During Prohibition, one block between 7th and Lenox Avenues packed in more speakeasies than any other street in New York City. It was called Swing Street.
133rd Street, Swing Street. Well, imagine this. Almost every building on the block has not only a speakeasy in the lower level, you now have apartment rent parties going on 2 or 3 floors all the time, constant at night. So coming down these little narrow sidewalks on any given evening after 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, you'd have the aroma of all these foods cooking, pianos playing, music going on. That is where integration happens. And that is where a Joan Crawford might stop by, or a Mae West would stop by, Duke Ellington and Fats Waller. That is why the speakeasies worked. It permitted them to come and everyone could be themselves. And that is why Swing Street worked, because it allowed the musicians to integrate and to share on an equal level.
133rd Street in Harlem gained a following among white New Yorkers from Midtown and downtown. One important person was Harold Arlen, who was a pianist and a songwriter who spent a great deal of time up in Harlem, went on to a great career on Broadway and in Hollywood, composing songs like Over the Rainbow. Many other musicians, Arthur Arshofsky, who became Artie Shaw, the great clarinetist and band leader, was inspired by the playing of African-American musicians.
There's another secret on Swing Street. Tilly's, one of the original speakeasy locations at 148 West 133rd, still survives as a jazz den. It's been reborn as Bill's Place, where Bill Saxton leads his band late into the night.
It is a speakeasy because we don't sell alcohol, but you can drink there. Now, the difference is we won't sell it to you. You have to bring your own. But the music, I think, is better. And the reason I say it's better is because we've had the benefit of all those other people. Fats Waller's, the benefit of Duke Ellington. So now we have a population of jazz artists who come through there now that are second to none, that are world class.
Jazz, literature, busting social barriers, they were all part of one of the most creative periods in American history. But Prohibition dragged on for 13 long years, and towards the end, when the Great Depression gripped the country, the bootleg champagne of the Roaring '20s had gone flat. Even Texas Guinan, queen of Manhattan's nightclubs, was having a hard time.
Near the end of Prohibition and the crash of the stock market, these clubs were no longer as fashionable, and therefore the cops began to distance themselves, could no longer protect her. So the allure of being in one of Texas's clubs is no longer there because now the raids aren't fun anymore.
Think of how the 1920s ends economically with a big crash. And that's what happened with a lot of Prohibition nightlife, that if you party that hard, it can all fall down around you. People could get famous quickly, and it was all gone quickly. Clubs were famous overnight and then disappeared. People made fortunes, and then they could lose them. Here's a woman whose career is built on fronting an illegal activity. You can't do that forever.
Texas made headlines again when she took a troupe of dancers to Paris, but the French didn't like competition and closed her show down. Suddenly, she was back in New York, making jokes about the authorities, just like old times.
I am the biggest sucker in the world. I went 3,000 miles to go to jail when I could have gone to any one of the best jails in New York City.
So this secret of New York is that the world's first female master of ceremonies, the symbol of the Roaring '20s, died far from the city that made her famous. An illness took Texas's life in Vancouver, Canada in November of 1933. It was 1 month before the repeal of Prohibition.
One could think that it's a strange irony that she dies a month before the repeal of Prohibition, but I think she died much earlier. She died once she no longer had her clubs.
West wind. Members of Congress hail passing of beer bill, and March 22nd, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt makes the 3.2 beverage legal.
The big lesson in Prohibition, I think, is that there are limits to reform. People really learned the hard way that you have to know where to stop.
Even when Prohibition stopped, the underground network that had supplied the speakeasies didn't stop. Prohibition didn't create the mob, but it gave criminals a chance to organize into a lethal force. You could still be young and make millions as a bootlegger. The trick was living long enough to spend it. Who were the underworld kingpins who kept the booze flowing? That's another story. Everywhere you turn in this thrilling and beautiful city, there are secrets to be found. You just have to know where to look for them. Whose moments on stage can become immortal, maybe more immortal than you think.